In this program, I'm going to cover 10 secrets, hacks, tricks, whatever you want to call them, all about starting seeds. I've grown over 2,000 different kinds of plants from seeds, so I know a little bit about this subject. The information I'm going to present works for all kinds of seeds, vegetables, perennials, trees, shrubs, grasses, doesn't matter. Here's a list of the topics we're going to cover. What type of dome should you use? How do you stop damping off? Should you use a heat mat? And how should you use it properly? When do you fertilize seedlings? How do you speed up germination? Should you be watering from the top or from the bottom? Should you plant directly or use the baggie method? What about this thing called dry stratification? What kind of seedling mix should you use? How about your lighting source? And how do you find out the best way to germinate a particular type of seed? You've got your seeds planted. Should you put a dome over top of them? And what type of dome should you use? There are shallow domes and really high domes. I'm a big believer in understanding why. So let's start with humidity. That's what these domes do. They create a high humidity environment for the seed to germinate. When the seed's underground, the soil around it is wet, and that provides almost 100% humidity. Above the soil level, the humidity is much closer to the room humidity. Now, a couple of millimeters above the soil, it's still fairly humid, but it's less than in the soil. Once we're a couple inches above that soil, it's pretty much room humidity. And usually in the winter, if you're heating your home, you're going to have a dry environment. So we put a dome on top to keep the humidity higher to make it easier for the seeds to germinate. All right, let's return to the question. Do you need a dome? Well, if your seed is larger and you've planted it deeper in soil, you really don't need a dome. That seed is surrounded by high humidity. The dome really doesn't add anything. Once that seedling germinates and the shoot of the seedling starts going above the surface of the soil, it doesn't need high humidity. If you planted very small seed and they're laying on top of the soil, then the bottom of the seed is moist, but the top tends to dry out. And that's when a dome works really well. What kind of dome should you use? Well, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't have to be fancy. Anything that you lay on top will increase that humidity. So for instance, saran wrap wrapped over your pots will do the trick just fine. Or you can use a shallow dome, or you can use a high dome. I was listening to a podcast recently, and the speaker there said that the low domes give you a higher humidity than the high dome. Well, that's simply not true. When you put a dome on top of your plants, the water will evaporate and saturate the air above it. It can't go anywhere. The dome's keeping it in. So fairly quickly, that air above the soil is 100%. And it doesn't matter how big your dome is. How long should you leave this on? How long does the seed need high humidity? And that's really the secret there. It's the seed that needs high humidity. As soon as you see germination, you should be taking the dome off. And so there's really not any difference between a low dome and a high dome. What you simply want to do is keep the seed moist until germination. As soon as you get germination, you got to open that up. And rather than taking the dome completely off one day, what I like to do is take it off slowly. Over a couple days, maybe a week. So you can raise one end, you can take the dome, and sometimes the fancy ones have openings. You can open them up. You can set it down kind of crooked. You can put something underneath to raise one end, anything like that. What you want to do is get normal air going in, and that will reduce the humidity. Do that for a couple days. Let the seedling adjust to the drier air of your home, and then take it off. So do I use a dome? I've never owned a dome, so the answer is no. I don't think they're really needed. Now, if I have very fine seed and I've put it on top of the soil, what I will do is take that pot and put it inside a baggie, and I find that works just as well. Close up the baggie, wait until germination, and as soon as you see germination, open the bag up. A couple days later, roll the bag down a little bit. So we still keep a little more humidity in there, but not as much as when the bag's sealed. And a baggie is really inexpensive and it's handy, so I like to use those. Now, if you use the trays, then I understand the dome works better. The dreaded damping off. So what is it? Damping off is a disease caused by a variety of different fungus. Now we talk about it as if it's one disease, but it's not. There's a whole series of different species of fungus that will cause damping off. As far as a gardener goes, we don't really care what the species is. You know that you have a problem when your seedlings are standing straight up one day and the next day they're laying down. And if you look at the stem right near the soil, you'll see it's shrunken down and very thin. That's damping off. The best thing to do for damping off is never get it in the first place. And there are two key things you can do there. One is keep the soil a little on the drier side. These seedlings don't need to be swimming in water, so don't get the soil too wet. Water well, let the soil dry a little bit, then water again. Don't water every day. The second piece of advice is the most important. Have a fan going 24 hours a day. Keep that air moving. That movement of air prevents the fungus from even growing in the first place. I hardly ever see damping off, and the reason is that I always keep the air flowing. One year I forgot to turn my fan on, and I did get damping off. Turned the fan on, and within days, the disease stopped. All right, so you didn't follow my advice. You didn't have the fan on. You have the disease, now what? There are probably some commercial fungicides you could spread, but there are two home remedies that in this case actually work. And I'm not a big believer in home remedies, but these two both work, and both of these do have antifungal properties, and that's been shown in science. The one is cinnamon, and it's the easier one to use. As soon as you see the problem, sprinkle cinnamon all over the surface of the soil and even on the plants. It won't harm them, and that seems to stop the fungus. The other one that I have used in the past, and it seems to work quite well, is chamomile tea. But cinnamon is so much easier to use, so that's the one to use. Once seedlings get their true leaves, you rarely see damping off. It's really a disease that attacks seedlings when they first come out of the soil. Do you need a heating mat? One of the things I see a lot on social media is that if you get your seeds warmer, they will germinate faster. That's not necessarily true. Every type of seed has a preferred temperature for germination, and every seed's a little different. If you're at that perfect temperature, warming them up will actually slow down germination, and if you get them warm enough, you'll actually stop the germination. Same is true on the cold side. If you're below the optimum temperature, germination is slower, and if you get too cold, it stops. Now it turns out that for most seed, room temperature is pretty close to optimum. Some seeds like tomatoes and peppers, they like to be a little warmer. And so if you're in a colder room and you want to raise them up to get faster germination, a heat mat works quite well. But how important is this rate of germination anyways? If I take tomato seed and I give them the perfect temperature, they're going to germinate in 4 to 5 days. If I'm a little cooler, they might take 7 days. And in a cold basement, maybe even 10 days. All right, so a cold basement is an extra 5 days. Who cares? Just start them 5 days earlier. You know when spring is, you know when they're going to go outside, you back calculate when you start your seeds. So just start them 5 days earlier and skip the heating mat. I think that's a simpler solution. So in summary, if you're germinating in a normal room temperature, I wouldn't bother with heating mats. If you're germinating in a cold basement, they can certainly be beneficial, and they will speed up the germination of most seed, but they're not necessary. Now there's one other thing that I want to tell you about heating mats. As soon as the seed germinates, you want to get them off the heating mat. You want to germinate warm, you want to grow cool. A heating mat is only used for germinating the seeds. Now, if you're trying to do this in a really cold environment, then a heating mat can be used even for growing the seed. But seedlings grow better at room temperature or even a little bit below room temperature. And for that reason, I don't usually bother with a heating mat. In fact, the only reason I use one now is because the manufacturer sent one to me for reviewing. And so I have it, so I might as well use it. I don't think I'd ever go out and buy one. It's just not necessary. Your seeds have germinated. You see little green things above the soil line. the shoots coming? When should you fertilize? Again, to understand this, I think it's important to go back and understand how plants grow. And then it all makes sense. And you can evaluate information you read online somewhere or information somebody tells you. If we look at a seed, it has a little embryo inside. That embryo turns into the shoot and the root. The rest of the seed, and that's like 95% of it, is filled with food, carbohydrates and proteins mostly. That's food to feed that embryo, to allow that embryo to grow, to allow it to make roots in the shoot. Most seed, when they germinate, they'll make two little leaves. And they all look pretty much the same. They're kind of round, they're indistinguishable. Those are cotyledon leaves. They're not true leaves yet. Those cotyledon leaves are developed from the food inside the seed. Once the plant starts making the true leaves, that's the next set of leaves, it needs to make its own food. To do that, it needs to get nutrients. And the place it's going to get that is through the root system. So when the true leaves start to grow, we need to get nutrients to the roots. So when do you fertilize? Well, that depends a little bit on the media that you're using, that soil that you're using. And by the way, I'll probably use the term soil, but I'm really talking about a soilless mix. Like, nobody starts these seeds in soil. Most of that material has no nutrients. Peat moss, for instance, has no nutrients. But manufacturers of these products do add some fertilizer, particularly the higher end products. So sometimes that seedling mix has some fertilizer in there. And if that's the case, you don't have to fertilize right away because the plant will get the nutrients from the fertilizer that the manufacturer put in. Now, I tend to use Promex, and they claim it has fertilizer in there too. I think it has a very small amount, and it doesn't really tell you on the package how much it has. So I assume it doesn't have any. And I start fertilizing as soon as the plant starts making the true leaves. Now, I might use half strength because the plant's quite small and doesn't need a lot of nutrients at that point. But I do start fertilizing right away. I recently heard someone say, well, I don't fertilize my seedlings at all. I grow them for 6 weeks indoors and then they go outside and I never fertilize. Well, that's probably because there's fertilizer in the media that they purchase. What we do know for sure is that the seedling needs nutrients when it starts making the true leaves. At that point, all the food inside the seed has been used up and it needs to start making its own food. If you go online and look at places like YouTube, you'll see a whole bunch of advice about germinating seeds faster. You have to be really careful with that advice. For instance, one of the videos I looked at, they claimed that you can take pepper seed and germinate it in 24 hours. And then they showed you some magic and the seeds were suddenly germinated. That's complete nonsense. Pepper seeds are the one vegetable that we know takes a longer time to germinate. And if you get it done in a week, you're doing really well. Bell peppers usually take a couple weeks, and hot peppers can take up to a month to germinate. Now, it's important to understand that seeds need certain conditions to germinate. If you provide those conditions, then you can't speed up the process. They're already getting ideal conditions. Now, if you're not providing the ideal conditions, then you can speed it up a little bit. So for instance, with pepper seeds, we know that they like to germinate warmer than most other vegetables. And so by increasing the temperature a little bit, you do speed it up a little bit. But we're talking days. We're not talking about going from 2 weeks to 24 hours. Don't believe that nonsense on the internet. You might be sitting there wondering, well, how do I know what the perfect conditions are? Well, I'll cover that later on in this program. Should you water from above or from below? To be honest, both work, as long as you do it correctly. Which method do I prefer? Well, it depends on the size of the seed. So let's say I'm taking a bean seed or even a tomato seed, which is quite a bit smaller, but it's still a good size. And I put that in the soil and I cover it with soil. I usually water from above. Before the seed germinates, I do that gently. I want the seed to remain covered. But I have no problem watering from above. And it's easier than doing it from below. Now, when I do small seed, the very fine stuff, that gets spread on top of the soil. It doesn't get dug into the soil. Now, when you come along and water from above, you disturb those seeds and you wash them around. And you might actually wash them too deep into the soil and they won't germinate. So for small seed, what I like to do is to put the seed on the soil and then take that pot and sit it in water for an hour. That will soak water up from below. Then I take that seed and put it in a baggie. And because it's closed, I don't lose very much water. And it's good until germination happens in most cases. After a week or so, you might need to sit it in water again. But that's the only real difference, whether you water from below or above. Now, I know some people claim, well, if you water from above, you put in too much water. And some people say the opposite with watering from below. That's not really true. When you water from above, you saturate the soil and the excess runs out the bottom. When you set it in water, it sucks it up and you end up in the same place. The difference in the two methods is that the very lowest level of soil in the pot may be a little wetter when you water from above, but the seed's much higher than that, so it doesn't really matter. Use the method that you prefer. Let's talk about the baggie method. So far in this program, I've talked about taking care of those seedlings as if they were planted in soil or soilless mix. But that's not how I start most seeds. I much prefer starting seeds using the baggie method. In short, the method goes like this. You take a paper towel, you put it inside a baggie, you wet it, you put the seeds on top, you close the bag, you turn the bag upside down so the paper towel's on top of the seeds, and you wait for germination. Now, I really like that method because I can see what's happening. I can see germination taking place. If I do it in soil and nothing shows up above the soil line, I don't know if I had germination. It's possible that they germinated and then got infected and died. It's possible they germinated and dried out and they died. So I can't tell the difference between a seed that didn't germinate and one that just wasn't cultured correct. And the baggie method, I know if they germinated because I can see it. Once they germinate, I put them in soil. The other advantage of that method is that if they don't germinate, I'm not wasting a whole bunch of pots and soil. The exception to the baggie method is very fine seed. And although you can use the baggie method, I actually prefer to take that seed and put it right on the soil. When small seeds germinate like that, it's just too hard to take each one up and plant it. And it's just easier to start in soil. If you've never tried the baggie method, give it a try. It's a great method. It's especially important if you have to stratify your seed. So what is stratification? Stratification is a process where we take the seed, we wet it, we get moisture into the seed, and then we give it a cold treatment. The perfect temperature for that cold treatment is in your refrigerator. It's not in your freezer. The freezer is too cold and it doesn't work for cold stratification. Again, I like using the baggie method because the baggies are easy to move in and out of a fridge. My wife doesn't exactly appreciate pots of soil in her fridge, but a little baggie with seeds in it is okay. Now there's this story floating around about dry stratification. This is where people take the seed and they leave it in the original seed pack and they put that in the fridge. That doesn't work. Dry seeds are dormant. Think of them as hibernating. Nothing happens in that seed until it gets moisture. The moisture activates certain enzymes and starts a whole bunch of biochemical reactions in the seed. Now it needs the stratification. Moisture has to come first. You can't dry stratify seed. Do you need a seedling mix? Well, the answer is no. And in fact, I don't use a seedling mix. I use ProMix, and I use the same medium for seeds as I do for my house plants and for transplanting seedlings, for my streptocarpus. Everything that I have indoors in pots, I use ProMix for. What is the difference between a seedling mix and just a potting mix? Well, not much really. The ingredients are essentially the same. The one difference is that a seedling mix tends to have finer particles. So they sift the material and they take the very fine stuff and they put it in a bag and call it a seedling mix. And that is nice to have for very small seeds, but it's not a requirement. So if you want to buy some seedling mix, that's fine. If you have some, certainly use it. Seeds might do a little better during the germination process. Once they're germinated and they have a root system, it doesn't really matter which one you use. So use the one you have. Don't go out and buy some new stuff. Here's an added bonus tip. Since we're talking about seedling mixes and medium, a lot of people go out and buy these Jiffy pucks. You know, they're compressed peat moss, and you put them in water and they expand, and then they put the seeds in there. Those really don't work very well. They dry out too fast. They're way too small. As soon as the seedling is a week old, you got to transplant it into a proper pot. Don't use those. They're a horrible idea. And if you're thinking of using things like eggshells and egg cartons, don't do that either. Those things are way too small. As soon as the seedling germinates and you see some green things above soil, you got to transplant it. So you might as well start in a bigger pot to start with. All right, you've been successful. You got germination. You got no fungal attacks. It's growing well. What is the biggest problem people deal with when they try to grow seedlings? It's light. We think the light in our room here is pretty bright, but it's not. When we compare this to sunlight, this is like sitting in a dark cave. So we take these seedlings and we give them pretty poor light, and they get long, skinny, tall. They bend towards the light. There's big spaces of stems between each set of leaves. We call that leggy. These seedlings are leggy. They're not very healthy seedlings. You have to give your seeds as much light as you can. If you're doing fluorescent lights or the new LED shop lights, you got to get those things really close to your plants. The closer the bulbs are, the more light the seedlings get, and the tougher they grow. If they're on a windowsill, turn them every day so that they don't bend over one way. Unless that windowsill is facing south or west, it's probably not getting enough light. Now, if you don't have the perfect light, it doesn't mean you can't grow seedlings. Just understand that they're not going to be the healthiest seedlings you can grow. And then when you take them outside and you get them acclimatized outside, you have to do it slowly, because they're going to go from this dark cave, which is your house, out into the full sun. Seedlings need a lot of light, especially vegetables. Give them as much light as you can. LED grow lights are pretty inexpensive now, and they're probably worth buying. So you have some strange seed that you've never grown before. How do you treat that seed? How do you know if it needs scarification or stratification or soaking? How do you know what temperature you should germinate it at? Every seed is different, and it's valuable to know that information. And I have a solution for you. There's a website called the Ontario Rock Garden and Hardy Plant Society. It's a group out of Ontario, Canada, and they have something called the Germination Guide. You don't have to be a member to use it. It's open to the public, and it's the best online source for seed information. They have information for 7,000 different types of plants. Most of the species you're going to want to grow are in there. All of the common things you want to grow, they're in there. And they will tell you exactly how to germinate those seeds. And what's really nice about this database is they've taken information from other well-known databases and combined them together. And over the last 20 years or so, gardeners like myself have been adding information to it and correcting it as we learn more about this. For most seeds, we still don't know a lot about how to germinate them. We usually have a way that works, but we don't know if it's the absolute best way. And as amateurs, you can contribute to that information by doing experiments. Anyways, if you want to know how to germinate a seed, look it up there, or read the back of the seed pack, which is generally correct. I hope those tricks will be useful to you. I've been germinating seeds for a lot of years. In fact, one of the first seeds I ever did were cactus. That was back in my early 20s. Now, if you'd like to learn more about that baggie method, have a look at this video right here. And if you want to learn about stratification, this is the perfect video. Happy seeding.